All right, everyone. Again, welcome to today's Titan Talk. We are very pleased to be hosting our second speaker, Marc Talluto, in the Innovation Series. I am Kaylee Matheson, Director of Alumni Engagement here at Illinois Wesleyan University. And today I am filling in for John Porton, the inaugural Director of the Petrick Idea Center at Illinois Wesleyan University, a new 50,000 square feet building that will serve as the nerve center for innovation, collaboration, and creativity grounded in the liberal arts. This new quarterly innovation series is a perfect example of what is to come. This series will feature alumni and university supporters who are creating, changing, and disrupting the products and services that will exist in the mid-21st century. A few housekeeping notes. You've probably already noticed that today's webinar is an audience member only, meaning that you do not have the ability to turn on your camera or your video. Or your microphone. Questions are encouraged and they can be submitted through the Q&A feature at any time during the webinar. If you have any technical issues, you may reach out to our Office of Alumni Engagement at 309-556-3145. And a recording of today's webinar will be available to view at the Office of Alumni Engagement YouTube page. And you will also be sent a link directly along with a short survey tomorrow. Illinois Wesleyan is very honored to have Mr. Marc Talluto, class of 1994, as a speaker for our innovation series today. Some of you may recognize Marc as he is a frequent visitor and lecturer on campus. And we are extremely thankful for Marc and Noelle's support of IWU and most recently the Petrick Idea Center. Marc is a serial entrepreneur and venture investor who has built and collaborated on numerous technology services and products companies. He's founded Fruition Partners and grew it from a bootstrap startup into a global system integrator for cloud software company ServiceNow. Fruition was awarded a place in the Inc. 500. It was Forbes' #1 inner city company in 2014 and was recognized by Brill Street as a top 50 employer. Fruition was acquired by DXC, where Marc further expanded the Fruition platform by globally consolidating and integrating numerous SoftwareNow regional partners. Currently, Marc is doing it all over again as a chairman of Thirdera and continues his pursuits as a limited partner, board member, educator, philanthropist, random hobbyist, husband, and dad. He does a lot, clearly. And please welcome me in joining Mr. Marc Talluto as our second innovation speaker. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaylee. I'm sure some of you who know me back in school are wondering how I got here. This topic is pretty interesting for me because it's a little bit of a story of kind of riding that, kind of the internet cloud wave of the last 20 years. But it's also, I spent a lot of time, speaking with the entrepreneurship students at the university. And kind of one of the things that I like to talk about is, kind of what is innovation and disruption and, how can you see new market opportunities? I think anybody on this call that's kind of been, working in various companies, really almost in any industry, you see the disruption that can be caused by new technologies, new processes, new ways of doing business, governance, compliance. There's always something that seems to be changing. So, with that, I'll kind of go into the presentation. And when they first asked me to do this, I thought to myself, how do you begin this conversation? So I said, okay, there's probably three parts here. One is, what is it exactly we're talking about? When we talk about disruption and, how do I see it? How do I know it's happening? Although it is kind of around us all the time, but it's certainly not a new idea. And then what is the cloud, right? So that's kind of, the work that we did at Fruition Partners, the company I'd built and continuing to do again, as Kaylee mentioned, with Thirdera. The cloud is something we all seem to kind of go like this. And that's kind of where a lot of our computing power is these days. But how did we get here? And then what does that disruption really mean? And kind of how did, in my kind of entrepreneurial business, how did we have to adapt and overcome to so many constant changes that were happening in the marketplace? So I'll start with disruption. And I like this quote, disruption, this isn't the definition, but the quote by Einstein is, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And, what I take away from this quote is I think about, some of what I do is a little bit of construction. And sometimes it's easy to build a new building, because you can, you can just build it, you can lay out, you can think about it a bunch. It takes some time to actually do the construction, but you have kind of a greenfield approach. Now, if you had to destroy the same building, that's probably even easier and might take one day, whereas building something new could take months. But what becomes really tricky is if you have to remodel something. If anybody here has ever tried to remodel their house while also living in it, that's kind of what happens with disruption. And kind of this quote is, there was a way of thinking of how we built a certain system, a certain business, a certain process, a certain technology. But over time, all of the reasons why we did that have changed, or the market we're serving, our customers, or maybe even other smaller pieces of technology that supported it. They're all constantly changing. And it really does take, new thinking and new ideas in order to kind of create and improve a system. So just this phrase disruption alone, I kind of like these two different definitions, right? It's a disturbance, it's an interruption of an activity or a process, but it's also a radical change to an existing industry. And technological innovation, I don't think they necessarily mean just computer science technology. There's a lot of different applications of the term technological innovation. And one thing I found interesting is that this is Google's usage of this phrase over time. It really didn't have a lot of mentions, but in the last like 40 years, that's really peaked. So the pace is accelerating for this kind of buzzy term. Now, one thing I like when we think about disruption, like what do I want to go disrupt and how to disrupt it? We talk to, one of the things we do in teaching the entrepreneurial students, Wesleyan, is to come up with just new ideas. And I think there's a lot of pressure sometimes to just have the next new big idea. But to be honest, sometimes, being first to market is a bad thing. And being second to market's a lot easier. There's a joke about, pioneers have to cut down a lot of trees in order to make farmland, whereas, the next generation just has farmland. And so this was a sign that was actually brought to me through Fred Luddy, who was the CEO of ServiceNow, the company that we built our company around. I like this concept, right? I don't necessarily have to build something new, but I can't do everything perfectly all the time, right? Do you want it good? Do you want it cheap, or do you want it fast? And all of these are ways I can improve a product or a service or some offering, but I can't do them all at once. And so one thing I always like to say when I think about being first to market or second to market is, when was the last time you Yahoo'd something? Chances are never, or it's been about, 15 years, right? We typically, Google is now a verb, kind of like Kleenex is for tissues, right? We just Google something. But that Google did not exist. Yahoo was there. Yahoo had a very dominant footprint in the search engine markets, give or take 2000 plus or minus. And then Google said, you know what, I'm sick of all these ads. I think we're just going to do something that's just going to be a lot faster. It's going to be more lightweight. And we're going to really, I don't know if they anticipated changing the industry like they did, but that was their innovation, was actually to do less, to make things just actually faster. Now, this is a phrase, creative destruction. So we talked about disruption, but this original phrase, so if you can, sorry, I have to move my own face out of the screen so I can read this. But this process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes, it's a lot to swallow here, revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one and incessantly creating a new one. So this idea, in the early 1900s by Joseph Schumpeter, this idea that, even though you establish your business, you establish some process, you have say your machines, your equipment, but something you will always be seeking kind of in business, and not just for business's sake, but also your consumers are seeking this too. They want something better, faster, cheaper, but we can also make discoveries that enable that, whether that's in, materials science, whether that's in, kind of the power sources you're using. There's a lot of different things that can create this destruction. So if we look at what they call these innovation cycles, which I found kind of interesting, you can almost see where we are, kind of at on this map. But this goes back all the way to, the late 1700s with these innovation cycles, and kind of what was being used from material sciences to sources of power. You can kind of see where we are, as this date 2020. But if you take a look at one thing that I find really interesting is these arcs, right? So the arc themselves, it's starting to compress, right? It's no longer taking 60 years to make that next innovation, right? It's getting down to 40 years, 30 years, 25 years. And these arcs, are getting much tighter. I like to say, if you look at just aviation alone, if you think about this fact, from the time it took the first people to fly a plane, the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, to when we landed on the moon, it was 66 years. And that's kind of incredible to think of all the advancements, whether that was engine and propulsion, whether it was materials science, our understanding of physics, computational capability. We went from just being able to fly about 60 yards with some wood and canvas to just landing a rocket on the moon, right? It's just an incredible pace of change that's happening, really, really fast. But one thing that I want to, if you think about this, it's not just these arcs, it's where these arcs kind of cross over, because this is where you start to see kind of a change in how people do things. You have some early adopters to the next, technology, to the next wave, people that are willing to, they didn't have to make those investments, in that building. They're able to kind of go with the next new thing. And it's those people or those businesses or even those consumers and what those changing demands need that start to propel that arc forward. I keep doing that. So I really, if you can tell, I really like this guy because I thought he had some really good quotes in here. But what I found kind of fascinating in doing a little bit of the research on the businesses that make up the Fortune 500, this quote popped up. So situations emerge in the process of creative destruction, which many firms may have to perish, that these businesses cannot change, they cannot adapt, that nevertheless they would be able to live on vigorously and usefully if they could weather a particular storm. Now, obviously, we don't mean a storm in the natural sense. We mean a economic storm. World wars happen, COVID happens. How many businesses, unfortunately, in our own hometowns, restaurants or other shops, given a situation like COVID, they were not able to survive. And so we start to think, I think misleadingly, that certain businesses, especially once they get to a certain size, have an ability to withstand, almost anything. Whatever that might be, whatever that storm is. But it's actually the contrary. So if you look at the disruption in the Fortune 500, and why I kind of always I do like to talk about this is kind of with the Google Yahoo comparison is there is always room for innovation and some disruption. And those disruptions are not caused by you, the business necessarily. I don't think any restaurants caused COVID. But I think that if people have to be willing to adopt to these changes, and they have to sometimes be radically quick, and if you're not nimble and your competitors are, then you'll find yourself out of business. But what's interesting here is, so the S&P index, I think I put S&P versus Fortune 500. In 1965, the average company stayed in there for 33 years. But by 1990, the tenure in the S&P 500 was narrowed to 20 years. Now, this is the S&P 500, Standard & Poor's, how these companies reach a certain size and then they're entered into the S&P 500. But as they shrink in size, they get dropped off the list and a new one is added. That tenure is now going to be 14 years. So half of all of the firms that are in the S&P 500 today will be replaced in the next 10 years. Heightened volatility, and we have a lot of massive disruption happening, not only technologically, but in a lot of other ways. So what I don't know if I necessarily like this, but I think it's worth noting that just because you're of a certain size and a certain scale of a company does not mean you're immune to certain disruptions. Now, some you can control, some you cannot control. I like to also talk, at this point of kind of what is an inhibitor or a resistance to change. Because even if you do, as a company, see that you should make, a change or a pivot to a new type of, technology, to a new offering, oftentimes, if you've spent the money and if you've made investments in whether it's machinery, whether you've trained all of your people, whether you have investments in various regions, it can be very hard to change how you do business, who you do business with, where you do business, and sometimes why you do business. These are very hard things because you spend so much time. It's like building that building. You spend a lot of time thinking about, where this building's going to be, much like your business, and the tools you'll need and the people and what you need to teach them and how you need to do business. That when a change happens, there's a lot of resistance because you've made so much investment in the way people do things. And I think, the other thing, organizational change, so we'll talk about this a little bit with fruition, but organizational change and changing people's behavior is probably one of the hardest things that I see companies doing of really all sizes and scales. Now, if you're smaller, you can be more nimble, but as you get larger, your ability to communicate with all your employees, to change new business offerings, to change new business models, to change your incentive programs, is extremely challenging. One thing, there was a quote I used to say in some presentations I give that it was, if you had to change your behavior or die, would you do it? And of course, everybody says, well, of course I would. And then you look at the leading causes of death, which are smoking, diet, stress, exercise. There's a lot of things that we as humans could change, and we probably at this point know are not good for us. But we keep doing kind of our old habits, right? So there's a lot of resistance to change, not only from the people within your company, but also because you've made so many investments in kind of how your business is functioning today. But it also represents an opportunity for smaller, more nimble companies to kind of take advantage of, I call it like as a tree grows, right? You have that bark, and between that bark, there's those cracks, and you start to see some light where nobody's operating in a given space, or they're not doing it well, cheap, or fast. And so there's some opportunities to step in there. So I like this one. When we think about, I mentioned this a few times, like what are the different facets that make something disruptive? Now I say a system, but it's kind of a business. It could be, like we talk about, as a people, as a process, as a technology, but really any one of those can be a trigger for a ripple effect, into other changes in your business. So take a look at this, right? We had taxis, right? We had taxis, and that was fine. And for those of you that don't remember, there was a time you had to call a taxi and then just hope they showed up. And you didn't know when, you didn't know where they were. You just were like, I don't know. I called them. And then somebody dispatched one using a CB radio. And they hoped they found your address. You hope they knew your street, and then maybe they'd show up. And who knows how long that would take. But once I had a cell phone, which everybody now knows, I have an ability to have an app. I'm also have a location. So I'm using GPS, not only to find me, but also to have, to know where this taxi is, who also then has a cell phone, and the ability to make payments virtually through that phone. Well, suddenly I get something like Uber. And what's fascinating about Uber is when they entered the San Francisco market, all they wanted to do was compare the revenue that they could make, that the taxi companies made at the time. And they said, well, if we only get 30 to 50% of that revenue, it'll be a good business. Over the years, they made like 500%. They created an entirely new market with more people willing to kind of take these taxis, if you will, because of this streamlined in operations. So what else do we have? Let's see if you guys can guess this one. We had movies, and we've had movies for like 100 years, right? And before that, there's Greek theaters where people are doing live shows, right? This is thousands of years of human nature. But once you add not just the internet, right? So those of us that remember the dial tone modems of the internet in the 90s, you really couldn't stream anything over those. But suddenly I also had high-speed bandwidth, right? And now Netflix comes along, and Hulu, and Prime Video. It has absolutely revolutionized, how we consume content and media. And I think what's also interesting, what's happening in this cloud computing era, it's not just that there's distribution means have changed. The insights that these companies have about our behaviors, what we watch, when we watch, who's watching, whether it's my kids watching, myself watching, whether I'm watching a series till the end, this is incredibly insightful. And why Netflix went from being a distributor of DVDs to a content creator. They used to only be able to show content created by other, movie houses or production companies. But they had the insights to know what people are watching and what they like. If you're wondering why Adam Sandler made this crazy comeback in the last 5 or 7 years, it's because Netflix, they realized people really loved his comedies, and now he's doing 7 new films because Netflix has that type of insight over our behavior. What else do we have? I'm pretty sure you guys can guess this one, right? We've had cars for a long time. We've had wheels and we've had buggies and we've had cars. And then lithium batteries came along, right? We're talking mid to late 90s. And I think the people that invented it actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. So then you get something like Tesla. Now, and I think what's really kind of cool, and I wanted to kind of put a spotlight on Tesla because I kind of find this sort of fascinating. So there's a ripple effect of a disruption, but there's also, like I mentioned, those resistors to that disruption. So electric cars, so how many of you believe they were starting to be commercially available in the 90s? You'd be correct. In the 1890s. That's right. So electric cars were the first cars to be manufactured and actually commercially available. The problem was with lead acid batteries, they just couldn't go that far. And so gasoline engine comes along, takes over. And that's why I mentioned, I was very specific with lithium batteries because electric vehicles were actually around for 100 and some years. But because now we have the ability to charge and recharge these batteries, suddenly, Tesla and a lot of other, companies, Rivian, obviously, Bloomington Normal, it really, really changes the market dynamic. But it's not necessarily a new idea. So sometimes disruption is waiting. Like there's a better idea, but it has limited abilities to be produced, in which case it's throttled. But look a little deeper. There's a study about why electric vehicles were not taking off. And this is probably about 8 to 10 years ago. Well, they had sent secret shoppers into various car dealerships to purchase an electric vehicle. And in 9 out of 10 cases, the consumer was talked out of buying an electric vehicle towards a gasoline car, a gasoline engine. Now you'd have to ask yourself, well, now why is that? Well, you have to look at the incentive structure kind of in this system. So if I'm a car dealer, I don't make that much money off selling you a car. I make more money, oil changes, engine repairs, a lot of things that can go wrong with a gasoline engine. They make more money on service and maintenance than they do on selling you a car. So if they sold a whole bunch of electric vehicles that didn't even have oil, that really didn't need much of a change or anything done with them, then they're really not incented to sell that to you. So sometimes, although the idea is great and the disruption makes sense, you're kind of fighting the establishment, if you will, of existing laws as well. Because remember, Tesla does not have car dealerships per se. And a lot of states mandated that you have car dealerships, in your various states. And Tesla has managed to get around that. But look at what else happens if you go into the, kind of the electric vehicle realm, which is obviously we don't need gasoline anymore. I have no use for engine oil. My brake pads, because it uses regenerative braking, which is kind of reverse motors to charge the batteries, that actually slows it down. The brake pads last 100,000 miles. And I don't really need coolant for an engine that doesn't exist. So then there's all these other ancillary kind of fix-it shops, muffler shops, oil change shops. It's like, well, how long do those make it, right? And that's just kind of a secondary and tertiary markets. The charging grid, though, this is where Tesla, obviously has hit a few roadblocks. Is consumer confidence to go buy a Tesla was inhibited a little bit by, range anxiety, as it's called. Although most people don't drive more than 50 miles in a given day, the thought of driving and going on a big road trip was inhibited. So they had to then establish, their own charging, not grid necessarily, but this charging system with their high-speed chargers. The one thing I also find very interesting is taxes, right? In a lot of states, the tolls you pay and the taxes on gasoline actually pay for a lot of the road improvements. So what happens when people don't buy gasoline, but still use all the same roads in all the same ways? Well, now that tax revenue is declining, but my need for maintenance on this infrastructure hasn't changed. If anything, it may have gone up. So in states like Washington, they're actually looking to impose taxes based on the miles you've driven, which used to be, I mean, when you think about it, it's a clever way to tax the gasoline, because typically you're driving once you buy gasoline. But if they have no means of taxing the gasoline you've consumed, how are they supposed to get tax money, in order to actually fix the roads? So now we're getting into the cloud for a second. So I think we kind of understood disruption, right? It can come in a lot of force, a lot of different ways and means, but it's ripple effect. There's a lot of resistors to it, and there's also a ripple effect when it does start to happen. So the cloud is one in particular that I'll kind of go into briefly. This isn't really necessarily a technical description of what the cloud is, but kind of more of an overview of its impact. So this is what I find interesting about this quote is it was in 1984, right? So almost 40 years ago, where they recognized that Sun Microsystems, if anybody's even heard of this computer brand anymore, the network is the computer. So what's interesting about that is very prescient on their part, but basically saying the ability to connect computers together, to share data, to get data from various sources is more important than just having a disconnected but very powerful computer, right? Basically, if it was not connected to something and couldn't get the data inputs and the ability to share data, it's kind of less powerful. And so that's actually a phrase that Sun Microsystems used for years. But one thing I like to point out, so everyone kind of asks, well, why is it called the cloud, right? Is it hooked into the stratosphere? No. What used to happen, and I won't dive too deep into this, but what used to happen is when you would draw network diagrams. So let's say this is Illinois Wesleyan University, and you've got various buildings. And at some point you're like, okay, well, I've got 20 PCs in Buck Hall. I've got 100, computers over in the Alumni Center, and I've got some servers over there. At some point you had to show a network map. But instead they're like, well, I'm not too concerned about the network. Let's just show it as a cloud. That's just kind of where a lot of stuff is. And I know there's stuff behind it. And sometimes that cloud represented going through maybe AT&T, maybe going, the wide area network through the phone company. Sometimes it represented kind of the local network. As you see here, LAN, WAN, network, internet. And it was always just sort of a cloud. That's just what we used. That kind of sort of stuck. It's like, well, my stuff's sort of in the cloud. But so this is kind of what's really important, and I kind of find this a little bit funny. But if you look at the various computing epochs, almost those same arcs that we saw before, the mainframe, now we're talking, this is early days, right? You have one main master computer that can process a lot of information, but all of your terminals, basically the way you access that mainframe, they're called dumb terminals. They literally almost can't process anything other than showing you a screen. And most of them had one color, green or orange, in order to mostly do everything on a text-based user interface, the UI. But it was extremely simple. But all of the computing power was centralized in that mainframe. And then the PC started to happen, and you had people with desktop home computers. So this computing power actually became more distributed. And so probably through, for the advent of PCs for about 20 years, the time window here is probably the mainframe, or, 60s and 70s, client server were kind of 80s, 90s, plus a little into the 2000s. This is where you started to become distributed. You took that mainframe, you chopped up some of its computing power. You might have a web server, then you have a database server, and you have other servers that can process different things, kind of like the mainframe used to, but we separated them into different servers. But also the PCs were out there that could also do some processing. So the network also still very important, but we started to distribute a lot of information out to these PCs and a lot of processing power. Now, one of the last things I'll say about this model is it is very complex to know what's running where, to know who's, I have a Windows 95 machine, this is back in the day, or no, I've got an OS2 machine, or I've got, basically different equipment. It's like before we standardized on, VHS, right? There's Betamax, there's video discs, you can hardly rent the movie you wanted if you didn't have the right equipment. So with all this various equipment, it was kind of hard. Although the processing power is distributed, it was also wildly variable. And then the cloud. Now, if you see something funny between the first picture on top and the picture at the bottom, you are correct. So what cloud computing essentially is, I call it centrally distributed. So our web browsers, the laptops maybe some of you are connecting on, they've essentially become these dumb terminals. Now, they have a lot of processing power on them, but for most of the applications we use, whether you're going to use Google Docs, whether you're in Gmail, whether you use some software for your company, nowadays it's mostly in the web browsers. With the advent of the web browser, now our very powerful PCs became like a dumb terminal. But what's really important is not the dumb terminal, it's what's inside that cloud. And what's inside that cloud is actually, there's a lot of computing horsepower that takes place in that cloud, but it's not just any cloud, right? Amazon has a cloud, Microsoft has their cloud, Google has their cloud. There's also a lot of private clouds that are out there. But for our sake, it's just easy to say we're connecting, to the cloud. But this cloud also relied on a lot of disruptions that happened, over the course of the last, probably 2 decades. The first off is, we had to standardize our networking, right? You guys probably don't know this, but today you think, well, I have an Ethernet cable, and if you've ever heard of TCP/IP, great. So not only do I have a cable, I've got a protocol to go with it. That was not the case in the 90s or the 80s. There's, probably, 7 different network protocols. You had literally different wires you could connect to different machines. And much like the VHS, Betamax, Laserdisc, memory stick, secure digital, there's different standards for connecting things. So we started to, kind of standardize. That was kind of a disruption, was the standardization, because it made the next thing possible. We also had ubiquitous internet access, right? This is pretty important. We used to have to connect directly to a specific wired connection to potentially talk to another device or another piece of equipment in another area. Now, and this is really only in the late 90s where we said, and some people said, I don't trust the internet because I don't know who's running it. Well, it's a good thing the government with DARPA, and this is more of originally a military thing to connect universities. Luckily, they made it free and ubiquitous because it is extremely reliable. I don't think we've ever thought, well, what happens if the internet goes down? As I mentioned before, high-speed access was actually critical in order to have a lot of the streaming content. And the one thing that I won't dig into too much, but virtualized processing, the ability for one computer to actually run 20, 30, 100 different things and different sessions and different processing power securely for different people. That was kind of a very critical part of this, because even when you're connecting to the cloud, you're connecting to a small portion of a large server potentially. It kind of starts to look like the mainframe all over again. All right, this is probably about as technical as we're going to get. I think the next thing, I kind of want to talk about Amazon for a second. We've all heard of Amazon, obviously, but the one thing that a lot of people don't know is AWS, Amazon Web Services. So Amazon now makes most of its profits from Amazon Web Services. And it's kind of funny because it happened it wasn't necessarily intentional that they were going to try to get this big, but they had a lot of processing power. They had a lot of their own data centers, and they started to think, how can I make my data center more available potentially to other groups within Amazon to, time slice, if you will, a little bit of time from that database server and a little bit of time from that, the networking elements and some other stuff. And this model that they created, well, they started to say, well, why would we only use it? Like, why not? Why just Amazon? Why wouldn't I have, maybe there's a bank or somebody else that needs to do some processing off hours, because they do a lot of their business in retail when people are awake. But when all of that computing power is sitting there, but most of their customers are asleep, but yet banks actually have to clear a lot of trades after hours once the markets close. it's kind of like a perfect synergy for if you have a lot of computing power and you're not using it, but somebody else will pay you to use it. Okay. If you can do it securely, safely, and quickly, good, fast, and cheap, then, well, that becomes, kind of the new paradigm. So Amazon in the last, if you look at the revenues alone, this is kind of crazy. And these are in billions of dollars. And we're honestly probably just getting started, because what also happened in this time frame is Microsoft was actually late to the game. They have a solution similar to Amazon called Microsoft Azure. Google, similar. They have Google, it's GCP, Google Cloud something. And like I said, there's many, many other ones, but this has had a massive disruption in how we run businesses, in how we do computing and processing. And it's really caused, an entire ripple effect, throughout the industry. But it just doesn't end with, AWS is considered the lowest form, right? The infrastructure side. By lowest form, I mean kind of the lowest layer of the computing stack, which is the infrastructure as a service. So if you look at commonly in cloud technologies these days, they will most likely segment things into either I want the infrastructure, which is I'm going to run my software, but I'm going to run it on your data center, AWS or Microsoft Azure. So I'm going to take my workloads and I'm going to move those applications, and they're just going to run in your data center and scale up and scale down. I think one of the largest companies that uses AWS is actually Netflix. They host their movies, they do all the distribution, they can scale up or down. And that's probably one thing I didn't mention, which I think is a very compelling reason to use cloud technologies is if you had to manage it, imagine you're a retail business and the most busiest time of the year is from November to December, right? It's the holiday shopping season. And if I had no other option, I would have to buy 200 servers to manage my web traffic and all the shopping horsepower I need, but I only really need it for like 6 weeks. But if I don't have it, I'm going to lose business. So basically, I've overpurchased probably by 70% for the rest of the year, just for those 6 weeks. Well, that's kind of the real appeal to the cloud. It's not just, somebody else is running it. When I need more, it just expands. It just absolutely can triple, quadruple. It can handle massive workloads and do that expansion possibly for a day, and then it comes back down. And you think about how many businesses have wildly variable, peak seasons and off seasons, different seasonality. To buy the computer equipment that you need only for the peaks is very expensive. So part of the pitch here is, you can kind of pay a standard fee, but if you need more instantaneously, we can give it to you. So anyways, that's the infrastructure side, which is where the AWS and Google and Microsoft sit. On the platform side, I think I'll hit platform last, but that's really AWS. And then, like I said, there are definitely other ones out there. If you look at a platform now, platform is where I can build software on your platform. So I don't have to necessarily use my own database. I don't have to figure out my own user interface. I don't need my own reporting backend. I don't need my own authentication services. When you think about building a piece of software, there's a lot that goes into it. And sometimes you have to code those from scratch. But if you use a platform as a service, so OutSystems is one of the companies I work with uses, it's a massive accelerator to actually build applications much quicker. And then finally, a lot of the software that I think we're used to using, Office 365, Google Docs, I know the university uses, ServiceNow, Salesforce.com is another one. ServiceNow is the company that we happen to partner with that actually is a software as a service, SaaS. So it does not take an installation. They don't ship you a disk and I have to figure out how to install it on a server. It just, basically have a web browser, connect to the cloud or their cloud in particular. And what's funny is ServiceNow technically is not running on AWS. So this term, the cloud, is a little fuzzy. To me, it's like when organic used to mean, I don't know what organic means. There's no certification for organic. It was just fresh. So the cloud is still kind of this nebulous term that basically means it's not running on your desktop, really. So ServiceNow runs in its own data centers, but it is scalable. but it's not, doesn't necessarily have that same flexibility as a infrastructure as a service. So this is kind of where our story changes a little bit. So this is a quote from me when I was trying to figure out how to actually run a company during massive disruption. Is I remember a business advisor told me something like, well, you're the CEO. Don't you think you should do that? And I was like, what exactly would you say a CEO is supposed to do? Because at the time it was just, basically pay the bills, make sure people are happy, and try to win new customers. And so that was, kind of the essence of Fruition Partners. That was the name of the company. And we partnered with ServiceNow. When we were, I think we met them, when they were about, so ServiceNow's growth, we met them in 2009. ServiceNow themselves are about 35 people. They were in San Diego. They would still surf over lunch and come back in and continue to code software. And today they're worth about $90 billion. So it was quite a rocket ship. And I think nothing probably embodies disruption than more than ServiceNow. They're actually the fastest growing, they grew faster to, I forget the 500 million, I think, than Salesforce.com did. And they're still now it's probably the company you never heard of, right? Because it's software that's designed for enterprise companies, not consumers. So if you've probably ever called Comcast, we've done work for Coca-Cola, for Target. What it is really, it's nothing really that exciting. It's kind of call ticket routing. When you call a help desk and you tell them you have a problem with your laptop, they can look up your laptop, they look up you, they understand the software that's installed, they try to track it and try to resolve it, right? Doesn't sound that, kind of amazing, but this is the type of growth they've had. Right now, when they went public, I never bought a share, and it was selling for $19, so I missed that one. And there's Fred Luddy. Now that's him on Forbes, and he's happy because I think because mainly he's a billionaire. But here's the funny thing about Fred. You talk about disruption, he was the head of technology for his main competitor, which was Peregrine, which then I believe went on to be BMC Remedy. So he came out of that company realizing they had an old business model. They were too expensive. They couldn't change fast enough. The technology that was around them, all these other concepts of the cloud, were coming in, and his former company really didn't have an answer for him. They couldn't change fast enough. And so Fred said, well, you know what? I know what we're trying to do over here in this old model, but that old model is almost unsustainable. We have too much weight. People talk about having baggage. Well, a lot of companies have baggage, and it's called tech debt is another way in technology companies. It's like you started to use a technology that's now antiquated, but you still have customers using it. So you're kind of stuck with them. So he separated, and he basically started coding everything else from scratch again. And it worked out pretty good. Now, for my part, or our part at Fruition, we met them in about 2009. And we kind of, basically made every last investment to kind of stay working, with them as they continued to skyrocket and go public. We also were acquired by DXC. Now, DXC used to be called CSC, and it's yet another type of disruption. Here is a company that had very old and outdated content. I'm talking about DXC now. At the time, that was a company that bought us. And why they bought us was because they had old software, old contracts, relationships, and kind of legacy companies, and they needed something new. They wanted to they realized technology was advancing much faster than their company was adapting. So we, Fruition, we kind of, with ServiceNow, of course, we represented something very new. It's kind of I call it a new gravy on top of an old pork chop. But that's kind of what we were. We were a new taste and a new scent, and it seemed different. And now DXC, Fruition was only 500 people when they bought us, and they were a company of 30,000 people. So even that little tiny, you talk about that ripple effect of disruption, we helped enable much larger deals for DXC because we could talk about cloud technologies. We could talk about ServiceNow. We had different ways of working that weren't sign a contract for 7 years and just, work on the same things. Now, this is when I had sold Fruition, I thought really ServiceNow's growth had peaked, and that was in 2016. So you can see how absolutely wrong I was. But doing it all over again, kind of like Haley mentioned in the introduction. So I had left Fruition and left DXC, and then basically realized that this market, this disruption was continuing. They were continuing to scale. They continue to innovate on their products. They have new offerings that go way outside what I mentioned with the help desk. And so it was, it's like we have to do this over again. So now it's kind of funny when you do something the second time. Thirdera is bigger than Fruition was after 2 years that it took Fruition to be in 10 years. So anyways, and I think the one thing, just kind of talking about disruption in services, every year for about 7 years when we met ServiceNow, we constantly had to be thinking about what's new for our customers, what's new for ServiceNow, what are the needs they're missing, what can we do? I think the one thing that was the biggest, what's the right way to say it? The biggest way we could address change was if it was not too far of a shift. But I mentioned organizational change in the past. It's hard to get people to do new things. And we didn't want to just take on a totally new service offering. We wanted to do something that was close to what we already knew how to do. And it was a logical connection to what we did previously. So these are the examples. This was kind of how we discussed our service offerings to our customers. But although it lists, there's 6 and probably another 50 more, this is how we built the company. So that consulting piece was really the first 5 years of being Fruition, and actually training came in about the 6th year. But then once we met ServiceNow, suddenly out of kind of nowhere, other than our consulting and training was on a methodology that the software enabled. And I really didn't want to do any type of cloud implementation work until a business advisor told me, do you like to make money or lose money? And I said, I think I like to make it more than lose it. And he's like, well, you should probably partner with the ServiceNow company because it seems like they're throwing business at you. I'm like, you know what? You're right. And so, but we had to retrain a lot of people, and we had to make significant investments. And what was kind of interesting about, talk about disruption again, we were not the first people to do ServiceNow work. There were other people that worked with their competitors, like I mentioned, BMC Remedy and some other tools, but they were locked in to their relationships that they had with their vendors or with their people who knew the prior technology, or their customers, and they had customer contracts. So it was, the advantage we had was we didn't have any of those legacy relationships. We were kind of struggling to get by, which I didn't realize was a blessing at the time. So then once we meet this kind of brand new cloud technology company that's booming, and we didn't know it was booming, we could easily jump in and be part of that disruption. So we kind of continuously said, okay, we have to build, now we need to do cloud integrations, because once you have ServiceNow, you need to connect to Salesforce, Workday, identity management, security management. And then we started to build applications on the cloud. It's a funny story about Fred Luddy again. He didn't build ServiceNow in order to be a help desk ticketing tool. He actually built it to be a platform as a service. What he found after a couple of years was when you tell somebody, well, here's some nail, some hammer, and some wood, what would you like? And they said, well, what can you build? He's like, well, whatever. What do you want? They're like, I don't know. What can you build? He's like, whatever. And so the sales process was pretty slow. And so I likened it to saying, well, I have a shed. Do you need a shed? Yep, I need a shed. Great, here's a sale. So he took his own platform and pivoted and said, I should just give people an application they know what it is so they can just buy it. Rather than saying, I can build whatever you want with this application platform, this is the application we're selling. And that's when it really took off. For years, he was trying to sell a platform, wood and nails, but people really didn't know why they needed it or why it was different. So he went back, basically built the tool he was very familiar with from his prior company. And that's when it really accelerated. And then we also did application development with new applications on top. And then finally, we got into managed services. We realized that there was a legacy business model from older software packages, whether that's SAP or Oracle or other enterprise software, where customers are like, listen, I don't have the knowledge, the skill, or the time to do the maintenance on this software. And we said, well, we'll do it. And so that eventually became almost 20% of our revenue. So we just really constantly were listening to the customer. We were listening to what the vendors were doing. And if you're wondering how we found ServiceNow, as a customer brought them to us and said, do you guys have an opinion on this software? And we were like, oh, yeah, I don't know. Let's not only look into it, but let's be willing to do business with them to understand, what's possible here. So I know we're kind of getting into time. I just found these interesting as I was reflecting on, the various roadblocks through both ServiceNow's growth and Fruition's growth, and some of those inhibitors and kind of what we had to do to either improvise, adapt, or overcome. I think the very first one was customers. They didn't want to work in the cloud. They didn't understand whose data center is it. Do I trust the people that are running that software? All very valid concerns. But we had to start to demonstrate and convince them of the cloud benefits. And the simplest one was we'd go into meetings and we'd say, listen, if your competitor showed up today, our competitor, ServiceNow's competitor, you'd have the software installed probably by next week or 2 weeks later, once they brought in the disks and they figured out the architecture and they installed it in all the right places. But during that meeting, they would just start a new instance of ServiceNow and say, here you go, which sounds novel today, but back then that was very revolutionary. We're talking about, 10 years ago. At the time, there were no technical resources that could install the software because it was so new. So we just had to hire computer science graduates and train them basically on the job because there were no people, on LinkedIn or otherwise that had any experience with the software, which also speaks to ServiceNow themselves. Never wrote a training manual for the first couple of years. You'd go to a class to learn their software and just be a person who happened to know something, who happened to tell you what to do, but never actually wrote it down. I know this is not, the 1930s. This was literally about 10 years ago. So we said, well, we'll develop that handbook and we'll run the classes because this was a great way to do marketing. And remember when I talked about, the pivot, we had done training in the past on a methodology that ServiceNow automated, but we only did the methodology. We didn't do ServiceNow, but we said, well, we're really good at running classes and training people. Why wouldn't we also create a handbook for the software company? And sure enough, we did. And we started to run their classes for them. Now, this one's just funny that if you're broke and you have to sponsor a conference and it's $5K, you don't pay them for as long as possible. And then eventually you pay them. So, but we were absolutely broke. Growth is expensive. This is something that was new and different. We had fixed price contracts. This was a way to get customers on board. Part of our challenge, if I mentioned I was broke, we basically accepted whatever project was offered because the first 50% we knew would come in, and the back 50% we weren't too sure when it would show up. But the first 50 was cash that we could keep, kind of feeding the company. The license resell margins, ServiceNow is trying to redefine the industry because it is SaaS. This is another incentive, like I mentioned, the auto dealerships. There were a lot of the reasons why their competitors could keep their partners locked in was because software used to have maintenance revenue that would go on for a decade. But that's not how SaaS works, right? You pay a subscription fee and your margins are actually pretty tight as a partner and a reseller. So we actually ended up selling none of their software because it really made no sense to us from a business standpoint. But we had to get credit for the fact that we were in the selling process with them. They had no advanced classes when they finally did get their training materials straight and they wrote their own book. They kind of stopped at, I would call, the 101 level. And they'd have massive user conferences, but it was mostly an ad for their software. And so we said, well, why don't we create our own conference? So we actually held a conference in Chicago for 2 years and invite a lot of customers to actually have our technical resources, teach other people kind of what we'd learned. And so that was a huge branding and marketing initiative. Customer outreach, they were having a hard time kind of penetrating the market because there's very established players. Once again, these resistance to change. So we actually, the ITIL was the methodology that we trained people on. And we decided if we could train people on the methodology, why don't we show off the software, for our students so they understand how the theory kind of met the practice in the software. And this led to probably close to 800 prospect companies coming through within a year. And then finally, and this is the ugly side of this, ServiceNow just kept stealing our ideas. Like we'd create new technology. We integrated voice telephony into ServiceNow, and they just took that idea with that vendor and actually put it into their product. Our managed service offering, I think they took our statement of work and they actually started selling it themselves. So you know what you do with that? You don't do anything. You say, well, this company's on a rocket ship and I like the ride. So anyways, a series of disruptions and roadblocks because you're bringing something new to market that is going to disrupt a lot of people's behavior, organizations, contracts, ways of doing business, and you just have to keep pivoting. So that is the end of my slide.
All right, Mark, there were a number of questions that came in, and we'll just kind of go through however many we have time. First one here came in through the chat. How important is the ability to scale once value creation has been achieved in this disruptive model?
Scale is super, super critical. Now, different businesses scale in different ways. So if you look at ServiceNow versus Fruition, ServiceNow being a software company, they could scale by buying more servers, right? The software you can just kind of cut, paste. And I'm not making it sound very easy, but it's the reason why software companies are valued at sometimes 15 times earnings. Whereas a services company like myself, I had to have a person has to work an hour to get paid. So my throttling factor and scaling capability was based on my ability to find good people, train them appropriately, and actually put them out, into the world. But scale is a really good question because you're right. Once you see that disruption, and you might have the perfect solution, but if you're only doing it for yourself or, in a small region, somebody else that can move faster is going to scale around you and kind of be your competitor. So yeah, scale is where I see a lot of businesses because we evaluate a lot of businesses for acquisition, and that's typically where they fall short. Is they don't scale. I always say it's when business owners spend too much time being a player and not being a coach. When you're a coach, you can coach a lot of players, but when you're just a player on the field, you're limiting yourself and your ability to scale.
Okay, another one that came in here was you used the term tech debt.
Yeah.
How important every company has those in their back office systems, whether that's accounting, human resources, training. How do you recommend companies best manage that tech debt?
The first thing that we would do is what I found is a lot of companies really don't have an honest inventory of kind of even what they own and where it actually sits, both from a software and a hardware standpoint. So when we would go in, because that's what the other thing ServiceNow does is actually, scans. This isn't a ServiceNow sales pitch, but it's about finding what you think you own and what you thought you had and what you thought was connected to what. So having an honest kind of a network diagram and architecture of, what are all my applications? What services, are they running? We would find massive overspend on licenses, redundant software package. Somebody bought something in Ohio that somebody in California also bought, and the vendors aren't going to tell you that you already have a contract. So I think the first thing you have to do is really understand what you have, kind of honestly, then try to figure out, should you consolidate some of those, solutions to the more modern, version of whatever that is to kind of start to get rid of some of that tech debt. Because I think what happens with tech debt also is I've seen some companies where they have a server that just keeps running because they don't know who even knows how to log into it, or if they had to make a change to the software, they couldn't find anybody that could make the change. So they just kind of keep letting it run. So that's not a great thing. So I think the first thing you have to do is really take an honest understanding of what you have and who's using it, and where you can do some consolidation.
Other ones, and again, if you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat feature, and we'll answer as many as we can get to. Another one here is, what are your observations about striking an appropriate balance between work on the truly disruptive innovations and the less grand but necessary incremental innovations to make systems in place just work better?
See, I'm a big fan of the incremental innovations. You know, because they're really, I don't think anybody really knows those truly disruptive ones. That kind of gets back to being first to market is hard. You know, people talk about a first mover advantage, but when you're the first person out there with this totally new, you know, kind of almost crazy idea, it's kind of like, look at the electric car, right? Like I said, it was available 130 years ago, but there were some limiting factors, right? And you could stand there and go, electric cars, yay. Or you could be Ford, find a better way to make gasoline engines. And then when you realize the world is pivoting, you invest in Rivian, which is now worth more than Ford. Well, I don't know nowadays with their stock price, but I think that incremental innovation is it's good to kind of keep sustaining yourself, but then it also may fund, you know, R&D, which we haven't talked about, but at a larger scale in companies, an R&D function is great, but it almost has to be so separate from how you do business and who you do business with. So it can kind of, back to Einstein's quote, you know, you have to have different people solving different problems. So if you could do incremental innovation while then funding really disruptive innovation, I mean, that's just my opinion. It seems like a good way to do it.
This one is very personal to your own experience. How did you know it was time to sell fruition in 2015? And what was that exit process like?
You know, for me, I think a couple of things. You never really know where a company's going, and we were 190% dependent on ServiceNow. That's everything we did. So had I known they were going to go from being worth 10 billion to 90 billion, I probably would have said, no, I should stick around. But I was like, no, you know, I don't know. I didn't have a lot of certainty, you know, kind of what their future was. But I think what really pushed me more towards it was kind of getting back to my own point on scaling. Scaling was getting hard. Like we went from, you know, going from 10 people to 100 people was like, wow, that just happened. And then we went from 100 to 500, but we bought a company in London. I took on private equity investors. We bought another company in Canada. It started to become hard to see everything, right, with both eyes. There's just so much going on. The sales motions were different, you know, change in leadership. I think I probably thought about selling more because I didn't think we could scale with ServiceNow, because we just didn't have the right people. And it would have been internally disruptive to us to get totally new leadership, have entirely new sales motions, having to reorg the company. And I didn't know if we could make it through that, you know, on the other side. I didn't know if I could make it through that, right? So just, you know, kind of being honest. It was seeing the pace of change and not thinking we could sustain that pace for much longer.
I have one from a student here. If you were back in college, what emerging or disruptive technology or combination of technologies would you want to invest more time learning in?
You mean today? Like today?
Yes, like let's assume figuratively you were a college student today.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of, I guess it's a broader question, or like what is being very disruptive today? So cryptocurrencies, and I personally equate cryptocurrencies to the dot-com bubble, but that's different than the internet as infrastructure. So as crypto is the blockchain, is what I consider .com is to the internet, right? So blockchain as a supporting technology is really, really interesting and revolutionizing things. We see it in the form of crypto, but I don't know, you know, I haven't checked the stock price of crypto these days, but that's, it's getting hurt with everything else. But that's probably one of the biggest and most interesting ones. The other one that is, I personally find fascinating is cybersecurity. It's, I mean, the more connected we are, the more cloud computing we have, the more mobile phone devices we have. It is a fascinating, I've done some research in cybersecurity and my private equity firm, there's an investment in a company that does cybersecurity. It's absolutely fascinating. A lot of what we see, there was a pipeline on the East Coast that was hijacked. There's entire cities of Baltimore had a ransomware attack. These are very coordinated and sophisticated attacks by franchisees of people in some of, Russia, North Korea, you pick it. But a lot of what we see is probably 5% of what's really happening. I've known people that have had, entire data loss, their business was seized up, the feds got involved, but it never made a single headline. So cybersecurity to me is kind of fascinating because it's behind the scenes, it's happening to all of us, but we don't really know it's there.
Another student question, for a student who may be interested in getting into a more professional services path like medicine and law, or even like the performing arts, graphic artists, not necessarily entrepreneurship, do you still recommend those classes being necessary while they're here at IWU? And would you take those if you were restarting now?
Wait, which classes? The entrepreneurship classes?
Yes. So would you consider getting more formal education in entrepreneurship classes now while in college, even if you aren't necessarily in an entrepreneurship path?
Oh yeah. So, I don't know if Professor Gerstner has anything to say about this. Just joking, Tara, I see that. But no, that's actually why entrepreneurship originally, or, kind of as I was talking to university, wasn't meant to be a major necessarily. It was meant to be a minor. So if you wanted to be in nursing, if you wanted to, run your own practice for nursing, if you wanted to be a musician, but yet you wanted to still have you wanted to teach kids how to actually learn music. I think it is appropriate for whatever your passion is, because it doesn't have, what passion is entrepreneurship, right? What are you going to do? You're going to entrepreneur? Is that even a verb, right? You have to have some business that you want to go do. So yeah, I would totally say take entrepreneurship classes, because if at some point you have this thought of, well, I could do this better, I should put up my own shingle and I'll start my own business. A lot of reasons why people, they're passionate about their business, but they don't take the business of their business seriously. And that could just be the simple mundane stuff of accounting, of marketing, of having some data, having some discipline about your business. Like, you could really be an amazing musician and you love teaching people how to play the piano. But if you never bill them for your time, well, you're going to be out of business pretty quick. So I think the entrepreneurship classes are a good enabler for you to actually follow those passions and to do really amazing things that are not necessarily business related, but they're kind of the backbone to kind of running your own business.
I think Tara would agree with you, and she came through in the chat and she said we still have an entrepreneurship minor as well for those of you who have a passion in something else. And she said, let Mark and I help you create a business around it. Okay, another question here that came through. Let's say, so you have an idea and you think it can be revolutionary. There's definitely a market for it. How do you get the business running enough to disrupt the market? Assuming you have the technical background and you can build the whole software alone. It's a little bit broad.
Well, I'll say this, I think the first thing anybody should do, there's kind of a chicken and egg challenge you run into. It's like, it's good to test the market to kind of see you have an amazing idea because you yourself would use it, or you and 7 of your closest friends would use it. Is it applicable to 100 million users? I don't know. So you sometimes have to go to market in some way just to get feedback on it. And I'm trying to do this with my own software company. I have a separate kind of side hustle in software. And what I've found more successful, now this is enterprise software versus consumer software, right? And that's another question. Are you targeting people, a consumer, or are you targeting businesses? Because it's kind of a different sales approach. But we're trying to work with a business to help us really flush out, is this product viable? Are we solving business problems? And we now think we have that. And once you can prove that you have a market, you've really found a niche, people are, whether it's using your software well, you can go. There are certainly angel investors, there's private equity, but they're not going to give you money based on a smile, right? They want you to see an actual built product that you see, that they can see people, using it. They'll ask you the same questions I did. In the future, there'll be a Titan Ventures. We're going to have a venture fund for Wesleyan and for alumni, but we don't have it quite yet.
Going back to what you had said about selling your own business earlier, what led you to start up again and redo it, go again in round 2?
Yeah, so, well, there's a couple things. One is ServiceNow kept growing and growing and growing. And so there's another pivot ServiceNow made. So when I was inside of DXC, I started to see, so ServiceNow is not that big compared to other mega software companies like Oracle, like SAP. And I was in the same department, if you will, that people that worked on those other software packages. And they would come in with contracts for like $30 million a year when I was lucky to get 100 grand. And I was like, wow, like I didn't know, I had no idea that you could sell that big of services contracts to these customers. But what I started to see was ServiceNow was becoming bigger and bigger, and it was winning deals at Nike, Target, Home Depot. It was in the Fortune 500. And so I started to look at that and go, ServiceNow is heading to the same place that these other companies are at. Those other companies have been around for another decade. So that was half of the equation. I'm like, well, ServiceNow keeps growing. The services that people need, if you looked at my little swim lanes of what I was, trying to pivot and build, I didn't realize how big the managed services piece could be, but I started to see that. And so, but the other thing that happened was a lot of other partners in the ecosystem. So like me at Fruition, right? We bought 3, I went to DXC and we bought 5 more, and we integrated them into one larger practice. But there are a lot of other smaller partners. Getting back to the question of scale, they weren't scaling, right? It's hard to hire salespeople. It's hard to, get a good brand name out there. It's hard to do good marketing. So where Fruition went from 2 to, almost 60 million, a lot of companies went from 1 to 6. And that's kind of where they stuck, around 6 to 10 million. So I looked back and said, the market for ServiceNow is growing tremendously, and these service offerings are getting bigger, but there's no partner that is kind of scaling up. So we said, well, why don't we bring in some really smart people who've done this before, whether it was from Fruition, and we actually brought in our largest competitor from Accenture to run the company. And then we bought 5 other companies to date, and we'll probably buy a couple more. But that was the impetus to doing the whole thing, is I feel like I probably left too early, and ServiceNow had a lot more runway to build a company around. And doing it the second time is way easier than doing it the first time.
All the experience, lessons we share. Another student question here. How have you been able to leverage your network at IWU to advance any of your ventures?
Honestly, all the time. And this is something we tell students is, if you look around in your classes and there's people and trust. Wesleyan has a really good community of not only smart people, but kind of good Midwestern work ethic folk. So like in building Fruition, there's an art major, a very good friend who became, he ran his own company, but he was doing branding and marketing for Fruition. Another friend of mine was our insurance agent. 2 other friends, one became my general counsel, another one became my international controller. Found another actually Wesleyan grad who graduated before me. He became my CFO. So there's a lot, and actually a very good friend of mine who was a banker. Like all of these people today will eventually get into some industry where they're going to know something about something, and they're going to be your point of contact for, hey, tell me about banking, tell me about marketing, tell me about, help me solve this legal problem I've got, or help me do the books, I can't figure out accounting. So if you're willing to ask for help from people, you're surrounded by a lot of good, talented, smart people that are actually, usually pretty honest and ethical. And that's probably the most important thing in business is, knowing people you can trust. But I've certainly leveraged the network of relationships and friends from Illinois Wesleyan to this day. It's been decades later, and I still rely on people from Wesleyan.
Okay, we have two more questions here that I have gotten that have come in. Again, this is kind of we are getting close to time here, so we will get through a few more if any more do come into the chat. But one here we have is, what factors should an entrepreneur consider when making a decision to either bootstrap or seek their own venture funding?
So here's my consideration. So the hardest part about getting funding is, what's it worth to you? Meaning, how much equity might you have to give up in your company in order to get that funding? So I didn't start Fruition until I'd already been working. I mean, I've been out in the industry for 7-8 years. So I kind of had a little bit of a kitty of cash I could live from. So I could take that risk. The thing about a services business is you don't need a lot of cash to get started, because you're basically paid for what you know, and you're paid by the hour. I didn't have to, I didn't have to build a building. I didn't have to, I didn't have to buy any equipment. I wasn't, building a manufacturing plant. But I think that's one of the biggest considerations is, if you can fund it yourself, which would be amazing, you have to figure out what most of your costs are. If your costs are your living expenses and your time, then go sleep on a couch in your parents' basement and just eat cold pizza for a while. If you need like more money for whether maybe it's marketing and maybe it's sales, is it something you could do as a side hustle? I guess I will always push somebody to not give up equity in order to retain more ownership in their company, and figure out other ways to earn money to get what you want. Now, the only caveat with that is, when and this gets back to the scaling question, when you finally have something that you're like, okay, it's proven, it's good, it works, that's when you can actually go get money, but you're going to get it at a much better valuation, because then you need to scale. There's the design and build phase, and then there's the we prove it, it's time to go scale phase. So for me, with Fruition, yeah, I looked for early capital. I'm almost glad nobody gave it to me, because I probably would have done something wrong with it. But when I finally was just at the absolute end of my rope, we were growing so fast. We probably did, so from 0 to 20 million was all bootstrapped. But had I not gotten venture capital money, and they were smart guys and girls that actually helped build the company further, I don't know if I'd be here. So in essence, how long can you hold out? And what are you really going to do with that money? And how much equity do you have to give up to get that money? That's a non-answer, but I'm a consultant, so that's okay.
And lastly here, another advice question. What advice would you have for already existing large companies like those on the S&P 500 to remain viable 5-10 years from now?
We worked for a lot of these large companies, right? So ServiceNow, luckily at Fruition, and even my time inside DXC, change is hard. And it's not just disruption necessarily, it's just changing. Like I said, really this theme, although we said disruption, it's a lot about just constant change in a business. And I think what ends up happening, why people, and maybe a better way to look at this is, some people change and some people don't change. I believe you have to have a internal company culture that is willing to kind of try new things and succeed and fail. And it really comes down to leadership saying, that's okay, bring me new ideas. It's other companies that I see, and DXC was kind of like this, which was, don't tell anybody any bad news and make it seem like everything's fine when actually things aren't going that well. And when you discourage people from bringing in new ideas, my saying was, even within Fruition, was, I don't mind if you break glass and you have a contradicting opinion to me, but come with a broom to sweep up that glass, because we're going to both have to figure out how to fix it together. And a lot of company cultures, especially when they get that large, they don't have the type of leadership that says, hey, we're welcoming new ideas, we'll make investments in some changes, we're willing to pilot some different ways of doing business. And that can be from everything from retail stores to food manufacturers to clothing. It's just hard because you have a very established business, and it's hard to bring in new products. So be willing to change. There you go.
I do have one comment in here from Tara that I really do think is important to mention. Marc is super involved with the entrepreneurship program, and she actually listed here, according to collegefactual.com, IWU has been ranked #1 in the state of Illinois and the Great Lakes region for its entrepreneurship programs, and it's #9 in the nation. She also, as a reminder, you can come and take a class with her as well as Marc, because he assists in the classroom space quite a bit. If you are a student or looking to get into the entrepreneurship program, whether you are major or minor at all. So
that's awesome. Did not know that.
Marc, again, just thank you so much for coming, sharing your knowledge. We are so lucky to have you as an alum of IWU so that you can come and have these communicational points with us. Again, thank you all for asking your questions. We really appreciate you and keep your ability to keep tuning in for these innovation series talks. We are going to have another innovation series talk on August 30th. That is featuring Hayden Kirkpatrick. He is the Vice President of Innovation and Venture Capital at State Farm. And there are other Titan Talks that will be occurring on our general Titan Talk series in June and July as well. You can find all those available at iwu.edu/alum/events. Again, thank you all so much. We will have a recording of this available and it will be sent to your inboxes tomorrow. Thanks again, Marc. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Bye, everybody.